Good evening. Welcome to the Wallace All Faiths Chapel and the Fish Interfaith Center. We are honored that you are here this evening for this evening of Holocaust Remembrance, sponsored by the Rogers Center for Holocaust Education. This chapel is sacred space and lends itself to embracing you in moments of holiness, memory, peace, and comfort. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, "The Jewish people is represented by every individual Jew. We need to remember where we came from. We are God's stake in human history. We must reawaken our consciousness of being involved in a history that transcends the interests and glories of particular dynasties and empires. The greatest sin for a Jew is to forget or not to know what he or she represents." I would encourage each of us to expand upon Rabbi Heschel's words and add that each one of us, regardless of our religious beliefs, whether we are Jews, Christians, Muslims, non-believers, and agnostics, must bear witness to history and never forget. It is too easy to forget. We shall not forget. It is too easy to be silent. We shall no longer be silent. It is too easy to be insensitive to the pain of a friend. We shall no longer be insensitive, but we shall beat our hearts. Eternal God, creator of the universe, we remember the 6 million who were murdered, the indifference and the evil that allowed this atrocity to happen. We ask you to strengthen us to stand up and speak out against anti-Semitism and acts of hate. We say never again, and we dedicate ourselves to this principle, to the idea that justice does not allow persecution, that genocide shall not be repeated, and that vigilance is the responsibility of freedom at all costs. We ask that you hear our prayers. We pray for the millions of souls who were lost and whose memories and stories we carry with us and will share with future generations. We pray that the lessons we learn from this darkest hour allow all humankind to better itself and to truly and nobly embody the idea that we are each made in your image. We ask that you answer our prayers and bring us to a world devoid of hatred and instead filled with peace. We gather in strength and solidarity this evening as we remember and honor the victims of the Holocaust.
Good evening. We are so pleased that after, that after 2 years of having a virtual event, to be back on campus for tonight's evening of Holocaust Remembrance. We also continue to live stream the event and will later post on YouTube for our friends, including many in the 1939 Society, who are no longer able to make the trip from Los Angeles. We are grateful for the many years and many times they were with us. I want to thank the president of the 1939 Society, Bill Elperin, and his spouse, Rosemary, for their many years of friendship and support of our Chapman Holocaust program, especially the Holocaust Art and Writing Contest. We honor the survivors and witnesses to the Holocaust who are with us this evening. May I ask them, along with members of the second, third, and yes, even fourth generation, to please stand if they are able to do so and be recognized. It's wonderful to look out and see your faces. And I really like the blue hair. Can't just let that go without some special recognition. So tonight marks the 23rd year. That Chapman University has presented this evening of remembrance and reflection. I admit that in April 2000, I had no idea that we would still be doing this 23 years later. Then, as now, the world was a violent place, with the Second Chechen War that would last for nearly a decade and cost tens of thousands of civilian lives. 23 years later, Russia is now at war with Ukraine. Each day we learn of death, brutality, and destruction, with more than 4 million Ukrainians forced to flee their homes. Elie Wiesel wrote often about the power of memory, saying that to live with memory is, quote, to live in more than one world, to prevent the past from fading, and to call upon the future to illuminate it, unquote. And tonight, on this evening of Holocaust Remembrance, we do that and more. For we also call upon the past to illuminate our present, to empower us to turn memory to action in the names of the millions whose lives were taken from them in the Holocaust, and the thousands who dared to intervene as rescuers and protectors. As Professor Wiesel said so often, neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Let us vow in the memory of those murdered in the Holocaust and in recognition of those suffering today to reject neutrality and to offer whatever humanitarian aid we can to those in desperate need due to the war in Ukraine. Dean Stearns will speak more about possibilities to give aid a little later this evening. Tonight we stand together as a community empowered by memory, united in our commitment to speak out and act against all forms of bigotry and hatred, anti-Semitism and racism, inhumanity and injustice. Courage and resistance took many forms during the Holocaust. We remember Emanuel Ringelblum and the clandestine group he gathered together in Warsaw under the code name Oinig Shabbos. By wielding pen and paper as their weapons, they refused to allow the perpetrators of genocide to have the last or abiding word. We remember 24 years old, Mordecai Anilevich, and the young people of the Warsaw Ghetto who chose physical resistance. We honor them for their courage and especially for their affirmation of dignity and hope over dehumanization and despair. And we remember Raphael Lemkin, who lost 49 members of his family to the Holocaust and dedicated the remainder of his life to seeking to prevent genocide, the word he coined, from happening again. We are honored to have with us this evening, as we have so many times before, and will, I hope, so many times in the future, to have with us once again Cantor Chayim Frenkel and his accompanist, David Kamenir. Cantor Frenkel will now offer a tribute in music, followed by the lighting of the candles of remembrance in honor of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Cantor Frenkel and David Kamenir.
Just last Saturday, we concluded Passover. And I wish to read part of a poem by Elie Wiesel called Ani Ma'amin, I Believe. A camp, an inmate, a creature without a name, a man without a face, without a destiny. It is night, the first night of Passover. The camp is asleep, he alone is awake. He talks to himself soundlessly. I hear his words. I capture his silence to himself, to me. He is saying, I have not partaken of matzot, nor of maror. I have not emptied the 4 cups, symbols of the 4 deliverances. I did not invite the hungry to share my repast, or even my hunger. No longer have I a son to ask me the 4 questions. No longer have I the strength to answer. The parable of Chad Gadya is misleading. God will not come to slay the slaughterer. The innocent victims will go unavenged. The ancient wish, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, will not be granted. I shall not be in Jerusalem next year, or anywhere else. We are in Egypt, and we are the ones to suffer God's plagues. Come, friend of the poor, defender of the oppressed, come. I shall wait for you. And even if you disappoint me, I shall go on waiting, for I believe. Ani mamin. Ani mamin. Ani mamin. Ani mamin. Be'emunah shleima. Beviat HaMoshiach. Beviat HaMoshiach. Ani mamin. V'af al pi sheyitmameya im kol zeh ani mamin. Ani mamin. Ani mamin. Ani mamin. Be'emunah shleima. Beviat HaMoshiach. Beviat HaMoshiach. Ani mamin. Ani mamin. Ani mamin. As we have done for the last 22 years here at Chapman University, tonight we light 6 candles in memory of the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust, including 1.5 million children. We honor those who are Holocaust survivors, survivors of the Shoah, who have shared their memories with the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generation, and with educators and students who will also be their witnesses to the future. As I read their names, may I ask the candle lighters to join me at the table. Anna Berg, Michael Bazyler, David Crowe, Fanya and Semyon Itzkovich could not be with us this evening. We invite survivor Claudia Cohen and her daughter Allison Cohen to join us for the lighting. Sam Silberberg and Brynn Tiano. As we read in Mishle in the book of Proverbs, Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam, the light of God is the soul of the human being. Blessed are you, creator of the light, who has placed within us your divine spark, who inspires us to pursue justice and seek peace. As together we say Amen. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord
Such beauty is an incredible gift. Thank you, both. It's an honor to introduce our speaker, Chapman University Presidential Fellow and acclaimed historian, Dr. David Crowe. Dr. Crowe is Professor Emeritus of History and Law at Elon University and the author of numerous articles, chapters, and books, including the definitive biography of Oskar Schindler. As many of you know, in 2016, Dr. Crowe generously donated his archive of materials on Oskar Schindler, the largest in the world, to Chapman University. Among his many recent works are Stalin's Justice, Show Trials, War Crimes Trials, and the Nuremberg Trials, and the second edition of his text, The Holocaust, Roots, History, and Aftermath. We are very much looking forward to his forthcoming book, Raphael Lemkin, The Life of a Visionary, which will be published in 2023. Dr. Crowe has served on the Education Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and has been an expert witness in scores of trials in the US, Canada, and Israel on issues related to the Roma, the Shoah, and Russian-Polish relations. Tonight, he will share with us his reflections on the topic, The Jewish World of Raphael Lemkin, and the question, apparently, given our world still too present, the question of genocide. Dr. Crowe.
One of the things that fulfills scholars in doing your research is when you come upon a cache of, oh, I'm sorry. My wife complains about my soft voice. My students do too. Is that better? Okay. I will fade probably because that's one of the things that I think scholars, particularly those of us that work in Eastern Europe and Russia doing research, Poland, things like that, it's when we come across a cache of documents, primary sources, that are transformative in the sense that they've never been used before, they've never been discovered. And I think this was definitely the case in my biography of Lemkin. Biographies take a long time, mainly because in the case of Schindler, it took 7.5 years. And the Lemkin biography is the same, taking about the same amount of time. What I thought I would do tonight is provide you some little vignettes of my research, and I don't know if I'm going to do conclusions. Mainly, I think I'll let you sort of interpret what I say to you in your own way. About Lemkin's life that when I began the research didn't know, particularly his Jewishness, his Jewish background, the impact of his Jewish faith and the lessons that he drew from that in terms of his brilliant work in international criminal law. Lemkin was born in 1900 in Russia, northwestern Russia. His parents managed a farm. And in his memoirs, he waxes romantically about farm life. You close your eyes and think about it, and you think it's an Iowa farm boy talking about cows and planting potatoes and things like that. But his parents, Joseph and Bella, were obsessive about all three of their sons getting a Jewish education. He lived on a farm in the middle of nowhere. I've been there. It's still in the middle of nowhere, in Belarus now. And it was hard. There were traveling rabbis that would go from Shtetl to Shtetl to train young children. Raphael, one of the sources I used were the Yizkor books in the New York Public Library. After the Shoah, communities from all over Eastern Europe and Russia got together and recreated as best they could the written history of their Jewish communities. They're absolutely fascinating works. In 1910, the family, because they wanted a better education for their children, moved to a place called Volkovysk, also today in Belarus. And there, Raphael blossomed. In 1913, when he's bar mitzvahed, he was already known in Volkovysk as a rising Hebrew scholar. Fast forward to 1955, he's doing an interview of his life with the B'nai B'rith Messenger, which was published in LA. And the first thing the author does, a 2-hour interview, first thing the author talks about is, we did the entire interview in Hebrew. And he said he was a brilliant Hebrew. And going through his vast archives, I mean, his archives is much larger than the Schindler archives, you would see notes in the margins in Hebrew and Yiddish. You know, that's how he thought. I know he wrote Hebrew Hebrew poetry in the 20s when he was in law school and things like that. He finished up his Hebrew education at the Hebrew Volksschule in Vilnius during World War I. Then he began law school at Jagiellonian in Krakow, and then transferred to Jan Kazimierz University in Lviv. And he was in Lviv from 1920 to 1926 when he got his doctorate in law. He was also very active in Jewish student affairs. There were, I discovered in the National Library of Israel, 29 articles in Yiddish by Lemkin written in the mid-1920s. And they focused principally on Zionism. And the central core of his message about Zionism was he was very frustrated with the fact that Zionists in Poland were politicizing the topic. They were arguing constantly about it. And he felt that the arguments that were taking place in Poland about Zionism was ripping the movement apart. He said, look, take the politics out. Go to the core of Zionism. This is what we need to do. You know, this is Aliyah. We don't need to fight. You know, we want to have kibbutzim, we want the youth going there, so on and so forth. But he also made another point. He said, at the same time that we're calling for a Jewish homeland, we also need to fight for equal rights in Poland. Don't give one up for the other. He says it's absolutely essential as Jews that we make the Polish government abide by the minority treaty that was dictated after the war. And so, he felt very strongly about that. Now, let me fast forward to 1928. There was a new Jewish feminist newspaper, that came out in Warsaw. And in 1928, he wrote 2 articles that give you 2 perspectives on his sort of outlook on the world as an Orthodox Jew. The first was a history of Jewish feminism in Germany. Why Germany? Well, Poland was a country in its infancy in 1928. It had only been around about 9 years. And so his editor said, look, do the article on Jewish feminism to show the Polish feminists how far they have to come. Poland's in its infancy, but still we need to make that contrast. The second article in Eva was the most fascinating and really went to the heart of his faith, I think. In 1927, a very controversial book was published in Poland called Hellenism and Judaism. And the author, Tadeusz Zelensky, no kin to the current president of Ukraine, was a very well-known classicist who studied Greece and Rome. And Zelensky made his core of his book was he said, Judaism was not the foundation of Christianity. He says Judaism was too primitive. It lacked the tenderness that would go into the makeup of Christianity and other criticisms of Judaism. He said in reality, where Christianity came from was Greek Hellenistic religion. Well, this angered Christians and Jews because he's saying that, Christianity's origin comes from pagan Greek religion. And then, of course, by criticizing Jews, obviously, they weren't particularly pleased by this as well. And what I found fascinating was Lemkin's response. It was oblique. He wrote an article in Eva about 3 or 4 months later on the Jewish child. And he came at it very tenderly. He said, in Judaism, Jews adore their children. Sow and reap is the Jewish message when it's come to children. And he said, even from the perspective of the child in the womb, the Jews so honor it that that child in the womb has the same rights as any Jewish person, male or female. And then he turned it around and said, but what about Greek Hellenism? And he then began to talk about infanticide. And he said, the Greeks, the father usually, would take and simply put the child out to die because it was disfigured or something like that. So it's really interesting, and this, of course, also is the beginning of the eugenics movement all over the Western world. And, of course, abortion and things like that fit in with the issue of Jewish liberal feminism and so forth. So there were multiple messages in what he wrote. Then in 1929, and again, I'm now leaping forward to an interview he did in early 1949, right after the Genocide Convention had been adopted by the United Nations. And he met a friend of his in Geneva who had been in a Jewish youth group called Yerdonai in Warsaw in 1929. And the Brent was asking Raphael, he said, do you remember our conversation in 1929? About what? Lemkin said. He said, in 1929, you were talking about the very ideas that were embedded in your Genocide Convention that just became international law in 1948. And he said, what do you feel about that? Lemkin turned to him and said, he said, if the League of Nations had adopted a genocide-type convention in 1933, of course, 1933 is the year that Hitler came to power, he said, we would not have lost 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. It would have been prevented. And this ties into where he's moving now. You know, he was an assistant Polish prosecutor. He was now becoming deeply, deeply involved in international criminal law. People don't realize that by the time World War II broke out, Raphael Lemkin was the most prominent international legal specialist in Europe. He was very highly respected. I mean, the bibliography of things he wrote in the 20s and 30s, numbers into the tens and tens of books and articles and things like that. Nobody knows it because the scholars that write about it, unfortunately, just look at his English memoirs, which left out a great deal about this particular period. One of the things that they were discussing in the late 20s and early 30s, international legal specialist, was what do we do now that disarmament is sort of in place? This is the first decade after the end of World War I. The big move was disarmament to prevent another war. By the late 20s and early 30s, with the rise of fascism in Italy, the growing power of the Nazis, not only in Germany, but fascist-type movements, particularly after the Depression, during the Depression. And even if you go to the East and look at the Soviet Union and the horror that was at play in that country, a lot of international legal specialists begin to talk about, we need to do something different. Disarmament's not going to get it. And Lemkin was part of that movement. And they began to explore, trying to define, and KIC was these international legal organizations made up of lawyers and jurists and things like that, began to identify crimes they thought could begin domestically and spill over into the national arena and perhaps trigger a war. And they began to sort of list crimes. They began to call them acts of terror. They weren't terror like we talk about today. It was something very different. And two of the crimes that really began to surface significantly were what they call vandalism, acts of vandalism, and acts of barbarism. And Lemkin became fascinated with all of this and was right in the middle of the discussions at various international conferences. He wrote papers and articles on it and things like that. The seminal year that this really sort of, became very important to him in many different ways was 1933, the year that Hitler comes to power in the early part of the year. Lemkin was to give a paper at a major international legal conference in Madrid. And so he prepared a paper. His mentor, a Supreme Court justice in Poland, Emil Rapoport, who was also Jewish, the conference was in October, late October. He called him on the phone late September and said, you can't go. He said, what? He said, you can't deliver your paper. He said, why? He said, the Minister of Justice read your paper, and he said, you've embarrassed the Polish nation. And Lemkin said, well, anything I can do? No. Now, a normal person would have taken stepped back and said, okay, that's it. That was not Raphael Lemkin. He then proceeded to write 4 separate articles. 2 of them were sent to Geneva, and his paper was in the program. Everybody at this conference read it. So we sent 2 of those, one private, one in the conference. But he also wrote 2 other papers. Now, this whole episode is really studied by scholars, but most of them, because they don't read German, they don't read Polish, they don't read French, the 3 languages he was simultaneously working in, have sort of twisted this all around. Lemkin sent a paper to an Austrian journal, legal journal, and then to Glasprawa, which was also a Polish legal journal. What got him in trouble was that when he began to talk about crimes of barbarism, one of the first crimes he specifically mentioned were pogroms. Well, pogrom only has one meaning. It's not about Armenians, it's not about, Uyghurs or Tibetans or anything like that. Pogroms mean these horrible riots and crimes against Jews. That's what alienated the Minister of Justice. But in the paper he sent to the Austrian journal, in the paper he sent to Glasprawa, a Polish legal journal, he also added extermination. And to this day, I don't know of any scholar who's worked on Lemkin has ever made that link. Now, up until that point in international criminal law, whenever you use that term, it was usually to refer to the Armenian genocide. I mean, that's how, in legal circles, that was considered the crime of crimes, what happened in World War I. The other thing that people get wrong is that right after they claimed that what triggered this was an article in a Polish right-wing nationalist journal, anti-Semitic journal, that there was an article that attacked Lemkin pretty viciously. Why? Basically, you're embarrassing the Polish people and the Polish nation because you're claiming, in using the term pogrom, you're it's like the Poles is now saying it were Polish camps, they were German camps. It's sort of the same idea. Well, the article didn't come out till after the conference was over. And that was what ultimately triggered, and his use of the term extermination, the Ministry of Justice to ask for his resignation. Well, this was a blessing in disguise for Raphael Lemkin, because he opened a private practice in 1934 that flourished. He became, within 6 years, a very well-to-do Polish lawyer. He was already a very well-to-do Polish lawyer. Remember that Poland had a very large Jewish community. And by the time we get to the mid-30s, the government is adopting policies that sort of remove lawyers. They're competing with Christian lawyers, and in this growing anti-Semitic climate, it became harder and harder for Polish Jews, businessmen, things like that, to get good attorneys, because a lot of them are they're not practicing anymore. And he was such a highly recognized, highly respected attorney in Poland, whether he worked for the government or not, that his career flourished. Now, on the 1st of September, and I'll end with this, on the 1st of September 1939, the Germans attacked Poland. 6 days later, Lemkin fled. First, because he was afraid he would be among those intellectuals. Remember what happened after Kristallnacht? The Germans rounded up 30,000 Jews and put them in concentration camps. He watched that. And because he was a well-known Polish intellectual, he was afraid that this is who they would come after. And so he fled Warsaw. He wanted to make it to Volkovysk. I can get from Volkovysk to Warsaw if I don't have to deal with Belarusian KGB guards in 4 hours. Or today, it would take you a full day, which it did the times I've been there. For him, it would have been a normal 8-hour trip. It took him 2 months to go from Warsaw to the south towards Romania and back up to get it to Volkovysk. Because on the 17th of September, he entered Soviet territory. Well, guess who had attacked Lemkin in a 1935 journal for his ideas on barbarism and vandalism? Andrei Vyshinsky, Joseph Stalin's legal mouthpiece, and Lemkin was afraid of the Russians. He was born in Russia. He spoke fluent Russian. He was terrified that either the Germans or the Soviets were going to capture him. Now, there's a story, and he has a section on this in his memoirs. And what he uses is during this 2-month period, he did finally make it vocalist. He sort of adds some stories. He puts it in people with him's mouths, but in reality, I think he used the opportunity of this section of his memoirs to basically have conversations about anti-Semitism in Poland, and he's moving forward and talking about other anti-Semitic acts. But there's one very poignant conversation he has. He writes that as he would go from Shtetl to Shtetl, hide with Jewish families in this 2-month trek. And he said that on one occasion, he spent a week with a Jewish family. Father was a baker. And that one night before Shabbat, he and the baker sat down and they had a conversation. And he was asking the baker, he said, aren't you afraid of the Nazis? The baker said, what are we fleeing? He said, aren't you afraid of the Nazis? Haven't you read Mein Kampf? He said, no. He said, we've always suffered under conquerors. This is what happens to Jews. He said, but we accept it. This is an elderly man. He said, accept it. He said, my faith is in God. And he said, God will take care of it, and so forth. Well, the next day, he talks to the baker's son. The baker's son, this is foolish. This is talk of death. It's like someone almost burying their own, preparing their own death. Lemkin didn't really respond, and I thought about it. It was just one of the most intimate moments for me in my research as I thought about this conversation back and forth of this generational difference, because it reminded Lemkin, I think, of his father, Joseph. Lemkin's nephew talked about, his father, Lemkin's father, religiously putting on his tough tefillin and things like that. And most people aren't aware, Dr. Harran mentioned it, and there's a letter I found in Swedish archives. He lived there for a year between the time he fled Poland and went to the United States in 1941. And I found some very interesting letters in the Swedish archives between Lemkin and his friends in Stockholm. And in late 1942, Lemkin learned that the Volkovist ghetto had been destroyed, and that the remnants of those in the ghetto had been sent to Treblinka. And he was desperate to find out if somehow his family, particularly his mother and father, who were elderly, they were in their 70s, they were in very bad health, might somehow have been saved. And he talks during this period about nightmares he had about his mother, particularly Bella. He adored his mother. I think personally that, and this is where I will, in my interpretation, might be totally wrong, we'll never know. I think as he agonized over the acceptance of the fact that his mother and father were murdered in Treblinka, that he took comfort in the words of this elderly baker. I like to think that as they were moving slowly to the gas chamber, this very sick elderly couple, Joseph in particular, comforted his wife with perhaps the Shema, and believe that at the moment of death, I will be in the loving hands and bosom of God. Thank you.
Wow. I want to thank you so much for your presence this evening. It means a lot to all of us that you are here. It's been moving to be with you this week following Passover. I'd like to thank Marilyn Harran and her team from the Rogers Center for Holocaust Education for this wonderful evening, shall we? Following El Malay Rachamim and the Kaddish and a final musical selection to come, I invite you to stay for a reception in the back of the chapel here today. And there, as Dr. Harran mentioned earlier, you'll find some information on ways to support the people of Ukraine. There's a table out there with a lot of information on it. I'd also like to thank Dr. Crowe for being here this evening. Dr. Crowe's, yes, please, thank you. Dr. Crowe's work on the biography of Raphael Lemkin, which he has been working on tirelessly for a long time now, who we know worked tirelessly so that Nazi criminals were prosecuted for the crime of genocide. Raphael Lemkin worked on that, and it has an enormous impact on us today. Lemkin's determination to define this international crime, which I learned tonight in speaking with David, that genocide is defined very specifically in a number of ways. His determination to define this international crime had such an impact, so that when the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide was adopted by the UN, it was fundamental to the prosecution of perpetrators of genocide against persons in many countries, including people of many backgrounds, including Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. Lemkin's tireless insistence that persons never get away with mass killing should inspire us today, when what we have to fear is not any one government or one religion, but the exertion of power, authoritarianism in its many forms. So emphasized Rabbi Clifford Cohen when he wrote just a few weeks ago about the meaning of Passover for today. In light of recent grievous crimes against the people of Ukraine by the Russian authoritarian regime, Cohen notes that the Haggadah promises God will save us from their hands. But since the Holocaust, he writes, divine intervention, a la the parting of the Red Sea, no longer figures into humanity's deal with God. Since biblical times, therefore, we must interpret that text a little bit differently, more like, given all with which I have blessed you, it's your turn. And he concludes, this year, one imperative is undeniable. To be an onlooker is not an option. To be an onlooker is not an option. To be an onlooker is not an option when it has been documented that thousands of civilians have been killed, when in parts of Ukraine, Jews have been forced to register in order to be easily identified and are among those who have perished. To be an onlooker is not an option when Black Ukrainians have been forced away from the border and not allowed to emigrate. To be an onlooker is not an option. This exertion of power is creeping in the form of nationalism in many countries across the globe, as we watch today. We must be vigilant, perhaps even here in the US, for threats to our own democracy. For anywhere legislation is enacted limiting freedoms or erasing the history or changing the history or minimizing the dignity of any one group of country, or one group of people in a country, we must beware. Censure of a people, rendering a people invisible, special registration of a people, singling out of a people to restrict their freedom anywhere anytime. To be an onlooker is simply not an option. Elie Wiesel, whose quotes we've heard this evening and who ring loudly among us at Chapman, wrote in his Nobel acceptance speech, "When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." So for now, our eyes are on Ukraine. Let us pledge to do our part for the freedom of innocent people. And we honor those who survived the Holocaust only to perish in the war in Ukraine, including 96-year-old Holocaust survivor Boris Romanchenko and 91-year-old Vanda Semyakova-Obikova. Sorry, I read that wrong. Vanda Semyana Obikovna. She managed to escape the Nazis by hiding out in a basement when they rounded up and killed the Jews of Mariupol, including many of her family. 8 decades later, amid a new threat to the town she loved, Obikova moved into another basement below a store. Without access to heat, water, or medical care, Vanda succumbed to illness with her daughter by her side. So this evening, in memory of Romanchenko and Obikovna, we light this candle. Thank you.
Please rise for the chanting of our prayer of memory, our El Malei Rachamim, by the world-renowned Shoah survivor and dear friend of Chapman University, Chazan Leopold Schneer. Yehi Zichro Baruch, may his memory be for a blessing. I presume we're having some technical difficulties. So I will read as they find the recording of Chazan Schneer chanting of the El Malei. I will read the translation. A creative one. We remember the victims of the Shoah, the young, the old, the innocent, 1.5 million children starved, shot, gassed, burned, and turned to ash because they were deemed guilty of the crime of being different. We remember what happens when hate takes hold of the human heart and turns it to stone. What happens when victims cry for help and there is no one listening? What happens when humanity fails to recognize that those who are not in our image are nonetheless in God's image? We remember and pay tribute to the survivors who bore witness to what happened and to the victims, so that robbed of their lives, they would not be robbed also of their deaths. We remember and give thanks for the righteous of the nations who saved lives, often at the risk of their own, teaching us how in the darkest night we can light a candle of hope. On Yom HaShoah, we call on you, Ribono Shel Olam, Almighty God, to help us hear your voice that says in every generation, do not murder, do not stand idly by. For the blood of your neighbor, do not oppress your stranger. May the souls of the victims be bound in the bond of everlasting life. Amen.
שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחות נכונו, תחת כנפי השכינו. במעלוס קדושים, קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרוקיע מעשירים. Es nishmos Achenu v'yachyoseinu, Achenu v'yachyoseinu, שנהרגו ושנשכחו אותו ושנסרו אפו ביד הרוצחים הגרמנים. על קידוש השם בגן עדן תהיה מנוחוסום לא כן בלו רחמים יסתירם בסייסר כנופוף ליהלומים ויצרור בצרור החיים. אסן ישמעיהם אדוני ונחלו ובוסום וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם ונאמר אמן.
We recite our Kaddish prayer, Kaddish Tom, the mourner's Kaddish, literally orphan's Kaddish. Together. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabba, be'alma divrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechonu v'yamechonu v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kari v'yimru amen. Yehei shemei Rabba mevarach le'alam u'lalmei almaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnasei, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudusha barichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shalama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav hu yaseh shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. As Rabbi Yutkin said in her address to us, that we must stand in solidarity. So too, we conclude this Yom HaShoah program here at Chapman University with Oseh Shalom. Let us stand in solidarity for peace. Oseh Shalom bimroma, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Laila Tov. Good evening.